Now, of course, the big news this week is the new post-polypectomy guidelines published by a combination of the BSG, the Association of Coloproctologists, and Public Health England. They're available on the BSG website. It also includes a post-colorectal cancer guideline, but I can't see much new in that side of the guideline actually, so I won't mention it any further. They're rather remarkable, I think. The authors managed to take a completely new, fresh look at the 2010 post-polypectomy guidelines. Of course, we've had bowel cancer screening introduced since then, so the fresh look was long overdue. But their look is rather fresher than everyone expected, I think. Now, the guidelines set out to answer the following 3 questions, and I fully expected very different answers to these questions. Who should be offered surveillance after polyps are found? I expect them to say everyone. What's the appropriate surveillance interval? As often as possible. When can surveillance be stopped? When the lid of the coffin is screwed down, that's when you stop. But that wasn't the case at all. In the introduction, you read that the greatest benefit in terms of colorectal cancer prevention is derived from the initial polypectomy, not the surveillance afterwards. One of the issues, I think, with the old guidelines were that they divided people into low, intermediate, and high risk. And of course, on that scale, everyone is at some level of risk. And I often got asked by patients after a colonoscopy, will I be okay, doc? And I used to try to settle them down by saying, well, you're far less likely to getting a bowel cancer than your wife is. Don't know if that was reassuring or not, but it just put it in some sort of context, how somewhat ridiculous the frequent post-polypectomy surveillance we used to do actually is. The new guidelines do recognize this, and in the introduction you read that surveillance should only be offered to individuals who are at higher than average population risk of getting bowel cancer. And the introduction goes on to say that also discusses the impact of surveillance should be balanced against the risk of harm, such as bleeding, perforations, psychological distress, cost. And these are things that are never discussed in guidelines. They never mention harms of surveillance or cost. That's been like a taboo subject until now. The guidelines also reminds us, and I think this is where they've gone a little bit too far, patients should be made aware that there are other things they can do to reduce the risk of bowel cancer. For example, they can lose weight, cut down on the red meat consumption, stop smoking perhaps, stop drinking, eat more fruit and veg. Laudable, of course, but nobody changes, not easily. And the whole point of post-polypectomy surveillance is that you don't need to change. You can go on and just as normal, because the colonoscopist is looking for mischief now. So let's look in more detail at this 50-page guideline, which are quite difficult to read at times. First of all, it recognizes that after removing a small polyp no larger than 9 mm, you don't need to organize a follow-up site check, provided that the adenomatous polyp did not contain high-grade dysplasia and that the serrated polyp did not contain dysplasia. High-grade dysplasia, of course, is actually probably in most pathologists' eyes the same as intramucosal cancer, so it does make a difference. I plead with the histopathologists that they start using the word intramucosal cancer in the colon. It's not part of the Vienna classification, that's why they're resisting. But I think it adds a degree of clarity to the understanding and the discussions with the endoscopists. You know what you're talking about if you say intramucosal cancer. High-grade dysplasia is a more nebulous kind of concept. Second, you should organize a site check before 6 months and then again at 18 months and finally a surveillance colonoscopy at 36 months after the index polypectomy, after the removal of polyps larger than 10 millimeter in size when the histopathologist department can't confirm that it has been completely removed. Any polyp harboring intramucosal cancer / high-grade dysplasia, which has not been confirmed as completely removed, and any SSL harboring dysplasia, which has not been confirmed as completely removed. Not controversial, I don't think. Patients with high-risk findings should be offered a polyp surveillance colonoscopy or a CTC after 3 years, and high-risk findings are listed as a 10 mm or larger serrated or adenomatous polyp, serrated polyp harboring dysplasia, any adenomatous polyps with high-grade dysplasia / intermucosal cancer, or patients with 5 or more adenomatous or serrated polyps, excluding little hyperplastic polyps in the rectum. Okay. And this is a completely new recommendation. I don't think I've seen it in any of the BSG guidelines to date. The NHS should stop surveillance when the patient is age 75 or has reached a life expectancy of less than 10 years. How on earth do you calculate the life expectancy of your patients? Well, you look them up on this website, and there are loads of kind of life expectancy calculators on there. It's very useful. Take a look for yourself. And then number 5, patients with an adenomatous or serrated polyp below the age of 45 should be offered surveillance colonoscopy every 5 years until they enter the NHS bowel cancer screening program. Because having a large serrated, well, they haven't really mentioned the size of these things actually, so it's a bit difficult to know. Is it any size adenomatous polyp? Or any number? Or is it just 1 2 mm adenomatous polyp below the age of 45? Don't really know. We need clarity here, guys. You need to probably refine this part of the guideline a bit. I don't quite understand, but at the moment, I would consider that any patient with any size adenomatous or serrated polyps below the age of 45 will be offered a 5-year surveillance colonoscopy until they're old enough to enter the NHS bowel cancer screening program. That's my conclusion. And then number 6, the following patients should be referred to a clinical geneticist. Any patient, well, the first 3 are the Amsterdam criteria for Lynch syndrome, of course. Anyone fulfilling the Lynch syndrome should be referred. No surprises there. Patients who's found to have a cancer, who also has a first-degree relative with cancer. First-degree relative, that'd be mum, dad, brother, sister. Patients below the age of 60 with 10 or more adenomas. Patients above the age of 60 with 20 more adenomas, patients above the age of 60 with 10 adenomas or more, and a family history of bowel cancer or polyposis. What constitutes a family history of polyposis? Grandmother having 2 polyps? I don't know. That needs to be refined, guys. Finally, patients with any suspected inherited bowel cancer syndrome, of course. So, what do we make of these guidelines? I think the authors could be congratulated for their very fresh look at the polyps and taking steps to reining in this crazy amount of polyp surveillance that we do in the UK. I think it's particularly noteworthy that the authors managed to pull this together without a single gastroenterologist in Leeds to help them out. Now, will these guidelines be enough to counteract the other kind of the gravitational pull, should I say, from a root cause analysis which will be take place every time one of your patients develops a post-colonoscopy colorectal cancer, well, within 3 years of your colonoscopy? That's of course going to pull in the other direction towards more surveillance, earlier surveillance, more frequent surveillance. I must admit that I remain rather skeptical. It's also noteworthy, I think, to say that these guidelines only kick in once you made absolutely sure that you removed every single little polyp, serrated or otherwise, from the patient's colon. So once you've done your colonoscopy, are you sure you removed every polyp? Was the bowel prep absolutely pristine, or were there areas you didn't see? Another result of this guideline is that if you don't remove a larger polyp single fragment, you actually generate an extra 2 side checks, and it rather puts the onus on the endoscopist to really make sure that they remove everything en bloc, certainly anything up to 10 millimeters, because otherwise you do put the patient through quite a lot of inconvenience of coming back for another couple of side checks. Now, en bloc resections aren't really a KPI in colonoscopy as yet, but I could see it coming. But By the way, a timely editorial in the BMJ this week recommended that only people above the risk of 3% of getting bowel cancer in the next 15 years should be offered bowel cancer screening. That's a very different take on things. And the author claims that by giving people all the facts, they will weigh up the pros and cons and then decide for themselves if they want to take part in bowel cancer screening or not. I rather suspect that the people most likely to look up their risk of colon cancer in the next 15 years on this website here below are probably the same people who are the most likely to bang on the GP's door demanding surveillance colonoscopy. So I don't think that the BMJ's new guideline will actually result in much reduction in or increased efficiency. In fact, when you start presenting patients with all the pros and cons of screening, they usually get cold feet about the whole thing, because of course the chance that they themselves benefit is always small and often finely balanced with the risk of harm. So what is next? Well, in Leeds we're implementing these guidelines and we're laminating them and putting them on each of this algorithm on each of our 10 endoscopy rooms walls. The guideline rather forms a benchmark for surveillance, other surveillance programs on the NHS. And I just wonder, for example, what should we do about Barrett surveillance? At the moment we're going on until the patient dies, but perhaps we should put an age limit on it, that patients aren't offered Barrett surveillance of 75 or once their life expectancies drop below 10 years. Finally, perhaps I should issue a little bit of a disclaimer here, because this 50-page guideline, read them for yourself, are quite difficult to understand in places, and I may very well have got something a bit wrong here. For example, they talk a lot about non-pedunculated polyps, which I think they include flat and sessile polyps into. But there's not much mention about pedunculated polyps. So in my kind of summary of the guidelines, I made some assumption which may not actually be correct. So I advise you to read the guidelines yourself to make sure. Anyway, you can read them at the web address below. And thank you very much for listening to this news podcast.